Welcome, Dr. Shane here. I wanted to take a moment to review some of the current knowledge we have regarding the microbiome and menopause. And in order to do that, I want to, let's say, contrast and compare a female microbiome during the childbearing years and some of the implications that occur during that period, and then how that changes and what those changes mean during the menopause years, because as we all know, it's a very challenging process, although I don't personally know it, but I know I have family and friends, and of course a lot of our clinicians and clients that undergo this very natural process, but it is severely impacted by changes in not only microbiome, but of course we can relate it back to environmental factors, things like toxins and how their upbringing is. The hormonal dysregulation, certainly things that disrupt the endocrine system, so endocrine disruptors, which we are all very aware of and need to look deeper into with research. And finally, the changes in the microbiota. So we have, the diet, environmental factors like endocrine disruptors, and the microbiota, and they're all interconnected. But to take a step back, let's look at the idea of what a microbiome should look like during the childbearing years for women. And that usually means, like everyone else, we want to create a certain level of diversity in our gut, which means, our diet has to be taken into consideration, our nutritional status, as well as our exposure to microbial growing carbohydrates or accessible carbohydrates. And these are all important to create a diverse microbiome that allows a woman in their childbearing years to not only have a really healthy gut microbiome, which is important because it becomes a critical part of not only the health of the woman herself and her hormonal relationship to that microbe system, but also the children that are going to be born and nurtured and gather and really inherit so many of those microbes. That's an important piece. And what that means is there's certain keystone organisms that we want to keep healthy in that microbiome, and yet we already know of certain ones that become problematic in issues like PCOS and estrogen dominance. And some of those organisms are what we consider they produce an enzyme called beta glucuronidases. And these beta glucuronidases are capable of metabolizing excreted estrogens through the bile and into the colon. And when they do that, they drive up the estrogen because they cleave this moiety, or this glucuronidase cuts it and allows that estrogen to get reabsorbed in the colon, and it raises estrogen. So for childbearing women, we want to look at the microbiome, which means I'm recommending we do microbiome tests for the people that have estrogen dominance, looking for those organisms that then cause the estrogen to rise when the body is trying to eliminate it as a byproduct or essentially just eliminate it through the bile in the colon. So that becomes a really what we call a problematic organism in the childbearing women, but in menopausal women, that same organism can have beneficial effects. So now that you can understand that and think about this in a very different context of one microbiome is different for childbearing women, but a similar microbiome in menopausal women can be a benefit, because generally speaking, estrogen drops so precipitously in some women that we want organisms that help recycle the estrogen that they're eliminating. So it's really it's two sides of the coin, where we want to make sure that in childbearing years we have a certain healthy style microbiome, but in menopausal years we want a different style of diverse microbiome. And if you overlay that with the vaginal microbiome, we see a similar story, where in childbearing years that microbiome is a diverse microbiome. It's not as diverse, nor do we want it as diverse as a childbearing person. We want it diverse, but the vaginal microbiome is by its innate nature not as diverse as the gut microbiome. In fact, there's some really interesting communities that live there that help nurture and really create the environment for fertility. And a lot of those characters, or a lot of those organisms are being well characterized. So that's a diversity factor we want, just not too high. In the menopausal years, we actually lose some of that diversity as well. So we want to regain some of this diversity in the vaginal microbiome in menopausal women, because it helps manage and essentially maintain a healthy environment in the vaginal area in terms of hormonal production, hormonal receptors, the way in which that tissue manages its tight junctions and all of its immune system, because it's still a very, very intricate system that has to have a healthy microbiome. And we know from studies, and most of these are done through academics, that microbiome, as women pass into menopause, as they transition, that microbiome becomes less and less diverse, not only their gut, but also their vaginal. So it's really it's a complicated story, mind you, but it really begs the question, how do we address this? What kind of things can we do? Well, clearly, one of the first things you can do is maintain these types of diets that help us create diversity. So we're talking about plants, we're talking about Mediterranean type diets, but be very cognizant of the number of antibiotic regimens. So we want to be cognizant of any time that there's a need for an antibiotic, that it's certainly, we want to certainly ask the question, is it necessary and why? And the answer might be yes, and so we do a rebuild after that. If the answer is no, let's get back to more probiotics, more prebiotics, watch our food intake, avoid all of the exposures to toxins that we know decimate microbiomes both in the gut and in the vaginal tract. And then ultimately, if we run, having a clinician run a microbiome test on these women, you can do both vaginal and gastrointestinal. We can learn what players are there. And if we have some that benefit the idea of estrogen processing in menopause, those are actually seen as more beneficial to menopausal women than they are for childbearing. And all of these things, of course, make a complicated journey, but we want to simplify it. And I'm hoping that by looking at probiotics, prebiotics, diet, avoidance of what we call the problematic compounds in our lives, from antibiotics to toxins, estrogen disruptors, or endocrine disruptors in general, that will help us build back the healthy microbiome over time, which is critical for people in menopause, because the hormonal component is so powerful, ups and downs throughout the cycle, because there is still a cycle throughout women's lives. It just changes because the hormones drop. But the microbes help regulate that. So if we can get the microbiome back in balance for people in menopause, women in menopause, it's so much more powerful for them to then navigate the changes. And we have many, many experiences in our world from our clinicians and some of our staff even, where they've benefited from this kind of approach. Hope that helps. I know I covered quite a bit, but there'll be more to come. We'll deep dive into these topics. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.